gonna hear a little bit. I think we should start with the history of Title IX and speak with our resident lawyer today. Kara, you want to take it away here?
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone who is joining us. As Linda said, my name is Kara Dansky. I'm an attorney and I serve on the interim steering committee of the Women's Human Rights Campaign's USA chapter. Thank you, Beth, for getting the screen share up. What I would like to do today is describe the history of Title IX through the stories of the people who were responsible for its enactment. I will also talk a bit about efforts to exempt women's sports from Title IX's coverage, and finish with a few words about the Women's Human Rights Campaign and why Title IX prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sex as opposed to gender identity in education is entirely consistent with the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. Title IX enactment, the basics. Beth, could you go to the next slide, please? Oh, this is an overview of what we'll be talking about. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Although it is most frequently associated with athletics today, Title IX, which amended the Higher Education Act, is not fundamentally about athletics. It is fundamentally about non-discrimination in the educational arena. It states simply, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The initial legislative draft was authored by Representative Patsy Mink with the assistance of Representative Edith Green. It was then co-authored and introduced to Congress by Senator Birch Bai in the US Senate and Congresswoman Patsy Mink in the House. Could we go to the next slide? Perhaps the most important individual in the effort to pass Title IX was Representative Patsy Mink. Patsy Matsu Takamoto was born on December 6, 1927, at a sugar plantation camp in Hawaii to descendants of Japanese immigrants. Patsy Takamoto graduated a valedictorian in her high school in 1944. She eventually studied at the University of Nebraska, where she worked to abolish what were, at the time, legal racial segregation policies. She eventually enrolled in the University of Chicago Law School, where she met John Mink, whom she married. They both graduated law school in 1951, had a daughter in 1952, and returned to Hawaii. Patsy Mink's story is a story about a woman's fierce refusal to accept the racist and sexist laws that tried to keep her in her place. Due to sexist laws that were in place in the early 1950s, she lost her Hawaiian territorial residency when she married, and she was denied the right to take the bar exam. She fought the law and won the right to take the exam and passed it. However, because she was married and had a child, no law firm would hire her. So she established her own law practice. She eventually won a seat on the Hawaiian Territorial House of Representatives, becoming the first Japanese American woman to do so. 2 years later, she became the first woman to serve in the Territorial Senate. She spoke in favor of civil rights at the 1960 Democratic National Convention and earned a seat in the US House of Representatives in 1964. She served a total of 12 terms in Congress. While there, she introduced the first comprehensive initiatives under the Early Childhood Education Act and worked on the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And finally, in 1972, she co-authored the Title IX Amendment of the Higher Education Act. Title IX was eventually renamed the Patsy Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act following her death in 2002. So today, although we refer to the law as Title IX, which is accurate, the law is technically called the Patsy Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act in her memory. I'll briefly mention the other two people who were instrumental in passing Title IX, but I wanted to go into some detail about the life of Patsy Mink because of her steadfast refusal to yield to the sexist and racist legal regime that worked hard to impede her progress. Can we have the next slide? Edith Green was a member of the House of Representatives from Oregon. Early on in her life, she was advised not to pursue a career in electrical engineering because she was a woman. When she was eventually elected to serve in the House of Representatives, she went about improving educational opportunities for women and girls. She was largely responsible for the enactment of the Equal Pay Act in 1963. And while she was pleased by the passage of the bill, she was annoyed that it, quote, took 8 years to persuade Congress that a woman doing identical work with a man ought to be paid the same salary. When Title IX was introduced in the House, Green was serving as chair of the Subcommittee on Higher Education of the Education and Labor Committee. She presided over 7 days of hearings on the bill. At the outset, she proclaimed, quote, "Let us not deceive ourselves. Our educational institutions have proven to be no bastions of democracy." Later, reflecting on the passage of Title IX, she stated, quote, "I don't know when I have ever been so pleased because I had worked so long and it had been such a tough battle." Green chose not to seek re-election in 1974, went on to teach in Oregon, and she died in 1987. Can we have the next slide? One day in 1940, a 12-year-old boy named Birch Bai asked his father a question. His father was the superintendent of the DC public school system and was scheduled to testify before Congress. Bai asked his father, "What are you going to tell them?" His father's response was, "I'm going to tell them that little girls need strong bodies to carry their minds around, just like little boys." Over 30 years later, Bai would go on to introduce Title IX in the United States Senate, while his colleagues Mink and Green introduced it in the House of Representatives. Birch Bai served as a US Senator from Indiana between 1963 and 1981. He died in 2019 at the age of 91. Could we have the next slide? As mentioned earlier, Title IX is not specifically about athletics. It's about non-discrimination on the basis of sex in education generally, because before its enactment, women and girls in the US had faced centuries of discrimination throughout the educational arena. The reason that this is significant is that one senator at the time, John Tower, introduced an amendment that would have exempted athletics from its provisions. What that means, in effect, is that a law that has come to be synonymous with the protection of women's athletics came very close to not protecting women's athletics at all. John Tower was born in 1925 in Houston, Texas. Early on in his life and career, he was a traditional Southern Democrat, though he switched to the Republican Party at some point in the early 1950s. As a senator, he opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1974, US Senator John Tower introduced the Tower Amendment, which would have exempted revenue-producing sports from Title IX compliance. Fortunately for female athletes, Congress rejected his amendment and passed an amendment proposed by US Senator Jacob Javits, directing the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to include, quote, "reasonable provisions considering the nature of particular sports adopted in its place." Women's sports were again threatened in the 1984 case of Grove City versus Bell, where the US Supreme Court ruled that Title IX affected only programs that directly receive federal assistance, which effectively eliminated the law's application to athletics programs. In 1988, however, the Civil Rights Restoration Act overrode Grove City versus Bell, stating that Title IX applied to all programs and activities of any educational institution receiving federal financial assistance. Can we have the next slide? In enacting Title IX, Congress was clear that the elimination of discrimination on the basis of sex in the educational arena was not intended to eliminate sex-segregated sports or spaces. The congressional record clearly states of the law's regulations that the regulations, quote, would allow enforcing agencies to permit differential treatment by sex only, such as in classes for pregnant girls or emotionally disturbed students, in sports facilities, or other instances where personal privacy must be preserved. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare went on to promote regulations in 1975, which explicitly allow for the maintenance of sex specificity and do not mention so-called gender identity. As one example, the regulations state this section does not prohibit grouping of students in physical education classes and activities by ability as assessed by objective standards of individual performance developed and applied without regard to sex. Can we have the next slide, please? In conclusion, I will just state that the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights is a global declaration that seeks to enshrine the category of sex as opposed to gender identity throughout law, policy, and society. It consists of 9 articles, which include definitions of the words women and girls and the protection of women's right to exist as a coherent legal category, the rights of mothers, the elimination of violence against women, and other legal rights such as the right to speak, assemble, and participate in politics and government as women. Article 7 of the Declaration states that to ensure fairness and safety for women and girls, the entry of boys and men who claim to have a female or female gender identities into teams, competitions, facilities, or changing rooms, among other things, set aside for women and girls should be prohibited as a form of sex discrimination. Anyone wishing to learn more about the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights can view it online at www.womensdeclaration.com. And if you're interested in reaching out, you can reach the country contacts for the US chapter at usa@womensdeclaration.org. Thank you so much for having me today. I really look forward to the rest of the discussion.